Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje estamos aqui com o professor Sindbäk, da Universidade de Aarhus, que é um convidado muito especial aqui, que eu tentei trazer várias vezes para o canal durante o ano passado, e hoje ele pôde estar aqui presente para iniciar a entrevista esse ano. E nós vamos conversar muito sobre a questão da Era Vic, alguns dos trabalhos que ele realizou, principalmente a questão das redes comerciais que existiam na Era Vic, na cidade de Ribe, em Aarhus. Então, vou passar agora para o professor. Professor, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to the Viking World Channel. Thank you again for being part of this channel. It's a pleasure receiving you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So for start, how did you start your career in this area? How your interest in the Viking Age start, and how you start to process your research in this area?
Well, that's a big question. I think I've been doing research. I've been fortunate to do research in the archaeology of this period for maybe 20 years now. So I started out as an archaeologist, as you know, and I was interested by the big changes that takes place in the northern maritime parts of Europe in this period. So you can come to the Viking Age from many different perspectives. Some starts with the mythology and fascinated by those aspects. Some starts from the historical events. And in my case, it was the archaeology. And I think it's a really interesting thing that although your initial starting point can be so very different, Icelandic texts or history writing from Western Europe or archaeological finds, you zoom in on this period as something, as a time when something really important seems to be going on, and we still sometimes struggle to figure out exactly what it is, but something is definitely going on. And in terms of the archaeology, one of the really intriguing things is that it's suddenly as if the wider world became a lot closer in the span of a few generations. And that's very literally what happens, because the beginning of the Viking Age is really the time when seafaring became developed. Maybe people were seafaring before in Northern Europe, but not on the scale and not in the way that happens after that. So we begin to find coins from the Middle East. We find pieces of jewelry that has come from Francia or the British Isles. We find traded objects that have come from Germany. So it's really quite a different world. And what really intrigues me is what did that mean to people living at the time? How did their world change in whatever little village they were living at, whether this is in a fjord in Norway or in the Danish plain? How did that change to them being part of a world that suddenly was so much bigger?
Well, that's a lot interesting. When we start to study the Viking Age, what is you consider the most important point for when we start to comprehend this period? Because some people say, oh, we would like to start for the mythology, and I would like to start because I see some movies like the Northman or the Viking series. But what is the point that really is very interesting for our start to comprehend this period?
I think for me, for this period, or really for any period, the thing that we must always start with is the people. Maybe the most exciting thing is not people who've been dead for 1,000 years. So obviously the echoes, the mythology, the great events, the great finds like the art objects, and so is something that captures our curiosity. But we can't really get on to begin to understand them until we get a sense of who these people are. So I want to know, where do they live? How were they organized? Which contacts did they have? What did they eat? What did they wear? And I think it's from that point of sort of basic statistics, in a way, that we can start to make sense of it. And I think there's a lot of interest in the contrast between the sometimes mundane reality that archaeology shows us, and then, the big stories. Because if it falls apart into either of those, like the grand mythology with tales of legends and mythological stories on one hand, and then on the other hand, some people living on some farm in a dark and wet corner of Europe, either of those things are not very interesting. But the moment let's say you stand on an excavation and you uncover the traces of house being that once was here, maybe a grave of somebody who died and was buried in this place, and you can connect it to, you can say people in this place were not just farmers living a hard life. They were farmers whose mythology we know, or we have at least some hint of what took place on their festive days when they had sacred rituals. What beliefs did they have about their own history, but also about the gods and the powers, the spiritual powers? I think that's when we start to connect with something that's a very different world from our own imagination.
Oh, that's a lot. Perspective, very interesting, because we saw that persons that want to be start in study the Viking Age was motivated by medias, but when they discover some parts of the reality, they say, "Oh, it's not like that. I think that was," and sometimes this is surprising people, because we saw that mythology and the life with the people that live in that time was very connected. And that's my next question about that, because you participate about a documentary about Odin by Danish TV.
Yes.
And that was very, very interesting when you talk about the perspectives about this god. Odin was part of all lives of the people, or he was divided by the, how can I explain, northern high society of that was warriors, that was more dedicated by this god, and the farmers are more dedicated like gods of fertility like Freya. How do you say about this perspective about Odin and his importance to the Viking Age society?
Well, Odin is a very strange character because he's not the kind of figure that really belongs in the common society. A god like Thor, who is, big, strong man, protector, who can turn away enemies, is much more popular. We can see many inscriptions and amulets that refer to him. Frey, the same, a god that or Freya, his female counterpart, who is responsible for fertility and for both human fertility and for your the fertility of your fields and crops. That's a more relatable figure for a farming society. But Odin in some ways looks like an intruder, doesn't he? And many people believe that he is a figure that enters an old mythology, perhaps partly as a result of a historical process. Maybe he's reflecting the great changes that takes place not in the Viking Age. Usually we sort of straitjacket history a little bit and say that the Viking Age is this confined period from around 790. 793 is a popular year to give us the beginning of the Viking Age, and then some 250 years onwards from that. The god Odin was definitely there before, but he may reflect the conditions and events that happened in the 300 years before that period, because we meet him especially in the migration period, in the Great Migration period in the 400s and 500s. That's when he sort of takes shape, both in iconography and in references. Being the researcher, I need to say, of course, that there are some references to something that, some idea that looks related even before that. But something happened in that period where the idea of what we see later as Odin really takes place. So historically, as a mythological concept, he is this warrior god and this sage and this shaman-like figure comes about in the age when big changes is happening on the European continent, when Germanic tribes are running into the Roman Empire, while we have the Hunnic warriors coming from the Central Asia. So there is a melting pot of influences, and Odin has a lot of that. As many people have said, there's a lot of shaman built into him, and he's in many ways not a sort of likable character. He's not the god you would sort of put your faith in, but he's very strong and powerful. If you read the Edda poems, there is the magnificent Havamal. I'm sure you're familiar with that, which is seems to be a narrative by Odin, or maybe some historians of religion think that it's a narrative by somebody disguised as Odin on the event of a cultic play or something. But you can see that this is a mysterious figure. He comes in, from the outside, he conceals himself. He says oblique things that you're not really sure what he's going to decide. So for that reason also, he's clearly a god of the military aristocracy, or elite, if you wanted to call them that. He's a powerful ruler of life and death, but he's not somebody who will protect your farm when you need it. But he may protect you on the battlefield if he chooses so.
Well, that's very interesting. Have a lot of information that I was learning now about Odin. That's very interesting because Odin has some very mysterious point about this god, and when the documentary was on air in the Danish TV, was a lot of interesting things, because they say that origin of Odin can be multiple things. Can be some god of Greece, like Zeus, or some god like Atlantean, like a warrior like Atlantean, or many things that can be originated Odin, and I was surprised about that, because
well, I think what television documentaries are a bit like that. If you pay too much attention, they'll actually sort of contradict themselves a little bit, because they need to sort of keep the story going. So I think if you look carefully at the various episodes, there are at least 3 or 4 different answers to where he originates. He's there even in the Roman period in some form. He's Attila, and he's somebody who comes in the mythology. So clearly not just a historical figure, but of course a mythological figure can be all those things at the same time. There's even one thing that always intrigues me is that if you count in some Indo-European languages, you get the names of the gods. Like if you do in Russian, 1 is Odin, Odin. 2 is Dvor, Thor. 3 is Tyr. And well, our own 4 is Frey. So there's some concept of that unites the mythological figures with the basic numbers of the world. And our weekdays in English is named after the gods, and in the old days, the planets in Scandinavian languages were named after the same god. So at some point, these people had an idea not just of mythological figures like the Greek gods, but something that was built together with their astronomy or astrology, and with their concept of time, and where all that comes from. It would not have happened in one place and at one time. This is the collected wisdom and ancient people thinking about the world and discovering secret meaning in it. I think there's also an element of Roman astrology that has sort of crept into the Nordic gods. If you notice it in the mythological stories, the gods are always wondering about. Well, that's partly because the gods are also the planets. When you see in the night sky the planets slowly passing, sort of, you don't see them in one night, but people would have watched them and seen, oh, some of these stars were moving. That's also the gods. People have pointed and say, oh, that's Thor. Or the Romans would have said Mars, or Venus, and so. But this is also an element. So the gods were many things to people. They were things up there in the sky. They were ancient heroes who had lived long time ago, and they were presences that might, as Odin sometimes do in the mythological poems, might wander into their homes, and probably did so in the figure of sacred place on the great feast days. We found little figurines from various parts of Scandinavia that seems to show, well, some people think they show gods, but if you look closely, there are hints that it looks more like they are people dressed up. And to my mind, at least, that goes so well together with some of the Eddic poems, which looks like they are performances, like the Havamal. Have you ever tried and read it out as if you were a performer? It works really, really well in this way. And so I think one of the things that would have happened on the say the Blod festival in November would be that people would gather, and some would have the role as the cult leader and would dress up, disguise himself, come into the hall. And, well, it's not completely a fair comparison, but think of children at Christmas Day when Santa Claus comes. Well, is it still your father disguised, or is it actually Santa Claus coming? I think that's the nature of a ritual, that even if people knew that it was somebody dressed up, it was also at another level the god that had come into their world. So in that sense, I think many people had seen Odin, felt the terror of this disguised being coming in to their own abodes.
That's a lot of information that was very, very, very nice, because we saw that many things that we know about Odin, it's a god that was part of some elites in Viking Age, but we saw that can be many possibilities of persons that was connected by interpretation, like you say, of can be a theatralis, some theatrical in the Viking Age relations of the Jews that you say.
Yeah,
That was very, very interesting to know that.
and I think, can I say, I also think we need to remember that what we think we know about Nordic mythology is what was remembered in the end around 1200 in Iceland, when the tales were written down. Now, we also know that there was nothing like a sacred book in the Viking Age. There were tales, there were poems, which were probably remembered, but there may have been others that were forgotten, and there may be parts that were tweaked and rewritten. There was not, we're so used to religion being carried by an organized body of a church society, or according to sacred texts. That would not have been how people in Scandinavia 1,000 years ago thought about their religion. To them, it was a mystery of the world that some people had an insight in, and they would recount stories, but they would also meet sages or religious specialists who might have reinterpreted what the legend said and come up with new versions. So it's a very open system, and maybe what survived in the end is only a part of that story. I don't think there were completely different gods, but maybe there were some different tales. Some of the tales that the Icelanders knew almost sound as if they are a little bit sort of tall stories that have developed after Christianity. Maybe the story about Thor going disguised to be wedded to the giant, maybe that's actually a bit of a mocking story. Maybe there was originally a myth that had a different context, but after Christianity came, somebody rewrote that story. So after all, what do we know? We need to understand that just like with the Nordic religion 1,000 years ago, our knowledge about this world is a fragmented and sort of very complex picture that we see some parts of, and other parts escape us, or we haven't found them yet. So I think that's a really clever way to approach history.
Oh, that's very, very, very good points of view that you showed us. It's because what we have much more about the stories of the mythology of the Viking. It's probably in the Eddas and sagas of that there was post era Viking, and that's interesting because what people think that we are in the Viking Age is exactly some with the points that was in this manuscript. Some things are similar, but not all the things are connected to this manuscript, because we have some difference between the times and the histories that was composed by this was in another era by Snorri Sturluson and other poets.
Exactly.
And yes, and you have some works about the commerce in some Viking Age areas, like Hebe, like some points, like in Aarhus, it's a city that was a commercial point in the Viking Age.
Yes.
So it's and what do you say about the importance of these trades made in the Viking Age, this connection networks, what this is was established in this period, how this can be one of the most important parts to analyzing how the Vikings was made his connections with the world.
I think it's really a fascinating aspect, and one that is again key to understand the famous raids. On one hand, why did people know in the first place the opportunities that were out in the world? I'm pretty sure, and I think we can show today that before the raiding really took off across the North Sea, there was 100 years when people from Norway began to experiment with sailing and sailed really for trade expeditions. It's much more safe to sail out on trading, obviously, but it's actually also a better reason for taking up sailing technology as opposed to rowing. If you're a large crew of warriors, it's actually not so useful to adopt the sail. Well, it can be in the end, but if you have a boat full of strong rowers, you can travel in that way without investing in all the knowledge and hardware that sailing needs. Now, that's what happened around 400 years before the Viking Age, when Norse Germans and Scandinavians came to England as Anglo-Saxons. Remember, there was this huge maritime migration long before the Viking Age, but that was in rowing boats. That was people following the coast and coming into England. We can also see that they left the biggest impact in the areas, in the coastal areas there. So when we come to the Viking Age, the real transformation is that the open ocean becomes navigable, and that story starts with the trading expeditions. Why do pirates, as they are, suddenly turn up in monasteries in Ireland and Scotland, northern England? Well, we don't know. We haven't interviewed them, but I strongly suspect that the people who were on board that ship had sailed to trading places like Ribe in Denmark and had met people there who could tell them everything about England, Scotland, and Ireland. And they would have realized that they could have traveled a direct route across the ocean. I think that's important. The other thing that's important is that we get new information on the cultural context and the results of the contact. And one example that really fascinates me is in Ribe, an early trading place which started out even before the Viking Age. In workshops there, we can follow how some of the iconography of Viking Age religion starts to come up. But it comes there in a context where people also handled things like old Roman coins and clearly saw the images there. And probably they also the craftsmen there would have traveled and would have also be familiar with images from the Frankish world. So suddenly we can see much more clearly how images could have been and ideas could have been transmitted and changed in that sort of context. And I think people underestimate how much happens in that sort of cultural interaction. We have, my favorite example is some casting molds we found in Ribe for a very intriguing little figure. Would have been a little tiny amulet, but it shows you a person, let's just say a person, dressed in what they would have identified as a female dress, but carrying weapons. So two things that at least sort of in an ordinary day understanding of this, patriarchal early medieval society would have been opposed. We can see in the texts and so on that there's a clear idea: men do the fighting, women not so much, or they do in mythology or so. But here we got it combined. And first we think, of course, wow, this is, here we've got an image of a female warrior. But then we start thinking, maybe going into battle in a long a dress with a long train and wearing big jewelry, it's not such a good idea. Maybe this little image is showing you something different. And what we think today is that maybe it's one of those ritual scenes. But the other thing which then strikes you is, if you look at the back of a Roman coin at the image of Victoria, which is very common there, what do you see? You see a female figure in a long dress wearing a shield and a spear and a helmet with a crest, just like on our figure. If we just put these two things together, we think, strange coincidence. But when you realize that this figure has been made in the trading place where old Roman coins were also still coming in as silver, you suddenly think, that's where they get the idea. It would have been very simple. They see these old things, they tell stories about them, they hear legends, maybe they know of some of the Roman context, and they translate that into it. So I think we can see by going back to the places where a culture is transmitted, we get to understand how some of these myths could have come about and could have been changed. I don't know how Odin changed, but maybe someday we will find equally traces that will show us how different legends and images work together to create some of that mythology. So I think both in terms of the practical societal developments and also in terms of the cultural and mythological developments, it's important to look at these at places like trading centers. That's really where people come together and new ideas have the best chance of emerging.
Well, that's information that was my mind blowing, because it's so amazing that you say, because I was never imagined that this figure that show a woman with a helmet, that was very similar. When I see that that's very similar to the Roman helmets, but I don't know what this idea. And when you say me that the Victoria in the Roman coin was similar, that I was thinking, oh, that's a good point, because how we can say that this is really have really coincidence about that. And this is very, very interesting to know that, because we only think that Vikings have ideas in separate ways, but they are inspired by others cultures, by other things that probably they call attention for they, and they say, oh, that's very interesting, how we can put this in our form of made some coins, made some pendants, and that's a lot interesting that you say about that.
It is really quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, one of the ways that today we think as humans about our own world, one of the ways we try to understand it is to contrast it with something that is either from olden times, from other times, or from far distant places. That's how we make sense of our own world, or we are the people who are in this way, and but people elsewhere are some in a different way. And when you look at things like that, you realize that people were doing the same 1,000 years ago. They may not have had the same kind of sources for history, but they were equally interested in how the world could be different. And they thought of that in terms of things that were far away, or from very old times, or belonging to mythology, to the hidden world. So they probably used it in a similar way to try and understand and make sense of their own world and their moral rules in that sense. So probably if well, important things in their life, like in a social sense, the justification of power hierarchies, or how the world is supposed to be in all kinds of ways, becomes mirrored in tales about places, times when it was different. And sometimes when we have the legends, we can see that the legends are really about people who abuse or are completely different than the ordinary world. So we get mythological narratives about really inversions of the right order of things. People going and talking to the dead, gods abusing basic moral principles and so on. And I think that we're really watching something that very much looks like the way we use history today.
Yes, it's very, very a very nice thing, because it's when we analyze this part of economy in the Viking Age, we only can say that we only start for the writings and forget sometimes the part of the tradings that was I consider one of the most important things, because the Vikings not only solve the things in ways but in the trades too. And this is on the highest point of this difference, because the trades are very significant. We have these objects that sometimes are changed by other object, or sometimes by the same system, the coin system. And this is a very nice point that you say. And I have a very curiosity about the start of the spirit, the Viking Age. We can say that the principal three countries was Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, of the origin of these people, or they are consider that they are from other countries and they start this thing. How we can say this the original point of the North Society of the Viking Age. The principal countries are these three, or are societies that was considered the Iceland, or
Well, at the start of the Viking Age, well, the simple thing that unites Denmark, Norway, and Sweden is that they have got very close to the same language. Well, there may have been dialect differences, but they're speaking the same language. So obviously, this is a community of people that has communication along the coast. Otherwise, we probably have had different languages emerging. So it's a big area where that has these things in common. If we move west, of course, they still have a lot in common with people like the Frisians or the Anglo-Saxons. Maybe remember 300 or 400 years earlier, these were actually the same, or from the same stock, and they still, imagine if you travel out, they would have been able to pick up very soon what they say. Frisian and English would not have been too different for them. But at another level, then, they are part of this maritime world where they are connected by constant interactions with very different people. So in one sense, the Sami in the polar regions of Scandinavia, or the Finns in Finland, or the Baltic people, are part of their worlds. You could see that they are part of the tales, even in the Icelandic narratives. Hundreds of years later, there's lots of these people from Bjarmar or Sami, the Lapps or Finns as they call them, or Livonians and so on. So they are connected to a lot of to sort of a greater cultural world where there's many different people. And obviously, sort of by the later Viking Age, people like the Irish are very much part of that too, or the Franks. Even some of the Mediterranean people are sort of on their radar. So, in one sense, of course, it makes sense to sort of isolate and say, well, there was this linguistic and community to begin with, and the North Atlantic island populations obviously had mostly built on immigrants from Norway, mostly Norway, but also presumably some from Denmark and Sweden, together with Irish. We know that from genetics. There's a lot of Irish, especially Irish women, who ended up in Iceland and the other North Atlantic colonies. So what we're actually seeing in the text by Snorre and the other famous Saga and Erik text is really an immigrant community that has developed slightly. They're very fiercely proud of some of their roots, and that's probably part of the reason why they're so keen on preserving it. But by the stage it is written down, they're really becoming a society of their own. We have contemporary, you probably know some of them, contemporary texts in Scandinavia that refers to the Icelanders really know our story. We must study the Icelanders to understand our own story, because they remember, we've forgotten. And that was probably true, because they had lived for 200 years in a society in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway that has seen a massive influence of Christian and really also sort of basically Roman Latin culture coming in. So at the end of the Viking Age, and certainly by the time of the saga writers, it's quite different societies, but still there is this common element of the Scandinavian sort of pretty common culture at the early Viking Age, which then when that maritime revolution really takes hold, becomes exposed to ideas from all over Europe, really, from the Black Sea and Russia in the east, and the Islamic east, and to the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles in the west.
Yeah, it's interesting because we saw that the Vikings are turning in the Nordic society in the Viking Age are turning multiple and diversified in this time because we saw that they are migrating for another countries, and sometimes we only think that the originals of the Viking Age are only in these three countries, but we can saw that this migration are part of this world too, and that's a very good point to show that is much more than only three countries, but they are connected by a web for a large society in this time. That's very nice that you say about that.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think of something like the Normans in sort of the around 1100, who established themselves in southern Italy, they think of themselves as sort of Scandinavian descent, and in some way they are, but they are this mixture of Frankish and Nordic roots. Culturally, they're much more Frankish than they're Nordic by the time. So, but they're also obviously an outgrowth of this maritime warrior society. What do the Normans do in Sicily, where they come in ships and they fight? So it history is always transforming, and what happens in, well, some people are sort of a little bit simplistic about it and say, well, the Norman history in the Mediterranean, that's just a continuation of the Viking Age. No, it's not. It's a new story that has completely absorbed and changed, but of course based on the old history.
We can consider that maybe these are used for show that they are sometimes specials because we have this Norse blood with and descendants of the Vikings. We can say that they are very proud of this, to say we are different from the other Europeans, or we can say that they are trying to establish a kingdom that say we don't be part of all the Christian people, to have this side that we are proud to be, that they are pagans, but they are our blood too. We can say that.
I think one interesting thing to note for that is, now that we have the genetic evidence, the DNA from ancient skeletons, we can actually see that in the Viking burials, we get people who received of honorable, rich burial, who were part Slavic, part Irish, part Finnish, part Sami. So, at least in the Viking Age, people did not necessarily have that notion. I think they were probably fiercely I don't know what to say, well, chauvinist, or so proud of their own way of doing, like people have always been. And they would have thought probably that the way they did it in their home village was the only way to be a really good person. And people in the next village were already a little bit mistaken. But that didn't prevent them from obviously mixing with so many different strains. That doesn't mean, of course, that it was sort of multicultural immigrant society as today, because after all, it's the early medieval world. Things go slowly. But if you look at those the big burial sites in Scandinavia, you can see that many different people were taken in, and they married. At least they got children together, we can see, and those children became honored members of their community. So I think that people in the Viking Age were probably less concerned with those aspects than some people are today. What mattered to them was if you were an honorable person, if you were a beautiful person, we've got those things picked up time and again in the at least in the saga people. So whether or not they are what we would consider sort of a particular ethnicity, maybe not so much. And remember, especially the Icelanders and the North Atlantic population, that's actually a strong mix of two genetically. I mean, we're studying the genetics, the Irish population is the old Celtic population of Central and Western Europe. In the Viking Age, these people would have looked very different from the Scandinavians, but that's the mixture which makes the North Atlantic population.
It's interesting because when we saw, sometimes we analyze some dynasties like William the Conqueror or Emma of Normandy, we saw sometimes that are some points that most people, when start to study or learn about this part of history, trying to compare and put some things of the Viking Age to relationship with this person because they are descendants of the Normans. But I think that they are some in a touch different. They have some things that they have this part of his own history, but they do things different for that part of that we know about the Viking Age, and that's a very, very interesting.
Well, the Normans are certainly, certainly well, sort of their own thing, and it's a very common thing you can see with elites in the Middle Ages, that they like to have a story that they're different from everybody else in their society. So we get these stories. The Normans will tell us that they are immigrants from Scandinavia who came down, but actually, if you follow it, they are a mixture of people from Francia and Scandinavia, and probably other things as well. You can find lots of examples of that if you move about in early medieval Europe. And the Scandinavian warriors, of course, who were, feared and well known, these maritime pirates, and so, of course, they were figures that a warrior elite would like to identify with. So I think that as much as there is a Scandinavian element in the Normannic dynasty and the Normannic elite there, it's also a story that they really, really like to emphasize.
Yeah, it's a thing that we not constant sometimes to see. We only think sometimes in the part of how the Viking influence the Normans, but we don't know the Normans that they have his own history, not only connected to the Viking Age, but they produce his own history. And that's the big difference of that. And I have some questions about thing that I think that was very interesting to question you. It's about we have the King Herod fortress The Trelleborg Fortress that I think you participated of this, another documentary in the Danish TV about that. And I was very curious because this structure was different from some things that we know in the Viking Age sometimes, that are the circular fortress are not only we have not much more of that now. We only have some villages that have the structure that we know, that the long house, the sometimes the pagan temples, or sometimes we saw that the farmers, the normal structures. But what is inside of this fortress? This fortress have a society living in this fortress, and what is, we can define this or how this work for the society, how this change the perspective of the Viking Age.
Well, you're asking about a very big mystery, because we, in the first place, we never knew about these fortresses from any written sources, and so it's not something that you would have thought. If somebody built these huge big fortresses, the biggest is 270 meters across. It's really very, very substantial monuments. You would have thought that that was something that had legends were told about and had been commemorated in poetry and sagas. It's not. It just completely disappears from history. So we really only have archaeology to tell us. And as you say, at one level, it's composed of elements that we can understand, like building a big earth timber fortification. All right, we've got that in various societies. The Anglo-Saxon kings do that in England. The Slavic princes do that in Poland, Czechia, further east. So, and that's part of warfare, having a place where you can gather lots of people and defend yourself against an enemy. But these places are also different because, for one thing, they were so meticulously laid out in a circle. It's very clearly also symbolic. They need to be something out of this world, like a geometric form that's landed in the landscape. They take great pains to level out the landscape so that they're just this perfect form. And when you enter them, and this is the second thing that's really weird and must have been strange to people at the time, unlike the fortresses in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, they're completely crammed with these big buildings. And the big halls are really, the prestige symbol in Scandinavian society. Owning a big hall where you could invite people in, you could hold big feasts. That's what makes you somebody special in Scandinavian society. And it's entirely that sort of buildings. It's not, small little houses for living. It's these big, symbolically important halls. Only there's not one, there's not a few. There is half a dozen or more put out in big courtyards, again, meticulously. So it plays on a lot of symbolism that we can understand what people would have, how they would have understood. Well, okay, here's a fortress, but not just any fortress. It's like this huge big fortress. And when we come in, there are halls, but halls everywhere, halls for more people than any ruler could have in their household or as their guests. So the question is really, what is the idea? What are they trying to do? And I think what we need to see is that they're doing something symbolical. It's not just a practical concern that we need these buildings for. In the past, it was sometimes said that, oh, this is administrative centers for kinship, or these are garrisons for warriors. No, they're making a point. They're making a symbolic point to people. But what exactly that point is, we're still trying to figure out. We know that they were used over a fairly short period of time, maybe just 10, 15 years. It could have been as little as that. And then most of them are destroyed again after Harold Bluetooth dies. But he's a very special ruler, as you probably know. I mean, he's the guy who officially pronounces Denmark Christian country. There would have been Christians there living there together with pagans previously, but Harold proclaims from now on, we should all be Christians. So the fortresses probably have some fortress policy has some relation to that. But what I've and other researchers have also noticed is that they coincide with a period when, for the first time in almost 200 years, first time since Charlemagne, really, there's a real military threat in Denmark. So instead of going out and threatening others on Viking raids, Harold has to take care of his kingdom. Remember, none of his predecessors did that for a long time. The German emperor actually comes to fight him, and successfully so, it appears. So he's in a very different place, and he has to prove that he has not lost the initiative. I think that's why he builds these, and I think the symbolism is partly to show his subject, I can protect you. I can protect you that night. No king you've seen here, and I can protect you in the old-fashioned, the customary way. You can, in my fortresses, you will not just be safe, you will be received in grand halls, like my honorable guests. I think his symbolism is something like that. But again, this is a mystery. It is not something that we have the answer for, and maybe still we'll discover things in the future that proves me wrong. This is just for the time being. I think this is the best explanation I can come up with. And you probably know these fortresses were just pronounced as UNESCO World Heritage. They're now recognized as some of the most, well, interesting but also important places in the history of this part of the world. So we and they're beautiful places to visit, I can tell. So I think they're so important to the story we can tell about the Viking Age. Not in spite of the fact that we don't know exactly what they are, but exactly because of that, because they're part of this plurality, this connection to something that's different, not just from our own society, but also different to our stories about the past. And I think there will remain a bit of that, and that's not a bad thing.
That's a very nice thing that you say, that because we saw that was one of the most, I think, longest dynasties. Was the King Harold Bluetooth. We start with Gorm and his wife Diva, and next Harold Bluetooth, and many successions. And how we can say the importance of this dynasty for this period? We can say that main changes are caused with that, and the descendants produced many cultural changes and cultural things, and economic and political changes. And what you can say that this period was in some point are different, or in some point they are important to define the next chapters of the end of the Viking world that we know. And if you think that Queen Tira was one of the governments in the time after his husband died.
Well, again, this is there's so many open-ended things. First, for Thyra, what we can definitely say is that she was, for some reason, very important in her family. It's not so common that women are commemorated on monuments. She's commemorated on at least 2 monuments, and maybe on even more. Harold Bluetooth commemorates her and his father on his big runestone. His father, Gorm, commemorates his wife. I can't think of any other, more than a handful of examples where that's the case. And then we've got this strange group of other runestones that's from about the same time and mentions Thyra, and which now seems to be, based on new results, maybe very closely connected. So the discussion previously was, is it the same Thyra or just somebody with the same name? But the most likely answer now is it actually is the same Thyra, that at least 3 different male rulers or heads of family are commemorating. That means she's something special. Now, what that is difficult to say, but we can look a little bit around and see what made queens special around this age, and we've got some very important and strong queens in the Viking Age and shortly after. We have Emma of Normandy, you mentioned before, who's definitely one. She was enormously important in her family, partly because she's clever and she plays her hand very well, and she's in a position to unite dynasties. So she would never have achieved the role she got if she had not been able to do that. But the role she plays is also something which would probably have existed at many levels of society, namely being sort of she is the kingmaker, right? She is the one who offers legitimacy and is the connection to particular histories, in a sense. So unfortunately, we don't know where she came from, but and there's various stories. But the way that she's treated by Gorm and Harold strongly suggests to me that she's very important for their legitimacy as kings. And remember, of all the things that Gorm writes on his stone and Harold puts on his stone, nobody ever, well, Gorm doesn't write who his parents is. That's very unusual. Usually when you make an inscription like that, you will say Gorm, who's the son of that. And that almost certainly means that Gorm was not a hereditary king. He was somebody who came to kingship. Now, how could he come to kingship? Well, I think there's only one reason, one answer there. It must be Thyra. So for some reason, she had a legitimacy that they lacked. They probably came there because Gorm was a strong ruler and was elected and accepted as king. But she must be the link to the old dynasty. There were kings long before that in Denmark. We don't always know a lot about them, but we actually know one thing that's very interesting here. Remember, her son's name is Harold. That's actually a name that at least 3 of the old Danish dynasty had carried. So I think it was customary to name sons after illustrious ancestors. I think that's a giveaway. I think that's what's happening. She's the link, not Gorm. So it's actually through Thyra that we may have a connection to an even older history.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Thyra probably was the woman that can be the passage for King Gorm to turn the king, because she was the real successor of the throne.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very
and
interesting.
remember also, this is quite interesting because it shows you that although it's, well, you know, it's the Viking Age, right? It's a very violent time in some ways. It's still a society where your legitimacy, the story about where you come from, is so important that you can only become a legitimate king if you have that story. People are not it's a civil society in a way. It's a society that has legitimacy. You can't just win a country by force and then be king. You must also have that connection to history, and you must have, you know, people must accept it. So I think it's also telling us that there's so many sides to this history. It's not just about warriors and bloody events. It's also really an organized society.
Oh, that's it's really know that, because we saw that the Viking Age was one of the most complex periods that we can analyze of the history of all Scandinavian, and the history from Europe too, because they are part of the much more bigger, the only that we discuss, that they are part of big web of the connections to other societies, and that's very, very interesting. And for finish, I would like to answer you, what the point that we can define that the turn the Viking Age was ended? What is the, we can say, the event or something that we can say that is the end of this period? How we can come to the end?
Well, I think that depends really on where you are. You may know, if you're in England, the Viking Age begins when people from Scandinavia first arrive in boats, and it ends very conveniently when they stop after 1066. But if you're in Ireland, that time in history does not really make any sense, because those links between the North and the North Atlantic and Irish society just continues in a way. The Viking Age continues into the 1100s in that part, and in Scandinavia, I don't think anyone realized that something had come to a conclusion in the mid 11th century. At one hand, the Christianization, of course, was a huge cultural change, and in some way, the whole 11th century is a sort of slow transition from the pagan warrior society into something different. And if we should put maybe one sort of signature event, maybe we should take the moment in 1103 when the royal saint Knut was pronounced. This was a Danish king who had died in 1086, actually while he was planning for an expedition to England, that never happened. But in the end, his family and the church had him turned into a patron saint, or recognized as a patron saint, and he's buried with all the trappings of being a royal saint. So in that generation, we can see both backwards to the old warrior society, and we can see into something which is so recognizably the European Middle Ages, which with hereditary dynasties that are closely associated with the king, with the church, and with organized links across Europe. So maybe that's where we leave the Viking Age.
Oh, that's very, very nice. And we can say that the saints are official for the Catholic Church, or can are official saint, or only in that period, or they are still official saints.
Well, I mean, they're more. I mean, King Saint Olaf in the end becomes even more significant. He's really probably the most popular Scandinavian saint, or at least royal saint in the Middle Ages. But I think that transition from Olaf is still very much a warrior king, but the transformation is complete in that sense by around 1100, and Scandinavia has become part of the European family of Christian nations.
Oh, that's very, very, very nice. Very interesting to know about all the things that changed in the world, saints and the persons that made part of this family. That was very, very interesting. Know about King Canute or the King Gorm and Harold. They are having very interesting stories to know about this period of in Scandinavia. Professor, I'd like to thank you so much for being doing this interview. It was a very pleasure receiving you. I was very pleased to having you to talk about this topic and this theme, because it's a very interesting period, and many persons are very, very interested in that, because we have a lot of medias today, movies and many things that people think that, oh, I am very interested about that. And it was I think that was a very good conversation, and it was a very immense good thing to receive in you in
Well,
this
thank you
channel.
so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's very interesting.
Thank you. I will just stop the recording.